this John Cook married on the 19th of January 1693 a woman named Jean Duncan, by whom he had a son, James, baptized 4th March 1694. This child, Johnson positively asserts, was afterwards father of the future Captain Cook. The dates of the marriage and baptism have been verified by the Reverend John Burley, minister of Ednam, and they agree with the probable date of the birth of Cook's father, for he died in 1778 at the age of 85. Owing to the loss of the church records for some years after 1698, Mr. Burley was unable to trace when this James Cook left Ednam to better himself, but he would take with him a certificate of church membership, which might possibly, but not probably, still exist. Attracted, perhaps, by the number of Scotch people who flocked into the north of Yorkshire to follow the alum trade, then at its height, James Cook settled down and married. And the first positive information to be obtained is that he and his wife Grace, her maiden name has so far escaped identification, though she is known to have been a native of Cleveland, resided for some time at Morton in the parish of Ormsby, and here their eldest child, John, was born in January 1727. Dr. Young says that James Cook had a superstition that his mother's farewell was prophetic of his marriage, for her words were, "God send you grace." Birthplace. Shortly after the birth of John, the Cooks left Morton for Marton, a village a few miles away, and the similarity of the two names has caused some confusion. At Marton, the father worked for a Mr. Mewburn, living in a small cottage built of mud, called in the district a clay biggin. This cottage was pulled down in 1786, when Major Rudd erected a mansion near the spot. Afterwards, when the mansion was burned to the ground, the site of the cottage was planted with trees, and was popularly known as Cook's Garth. Dr. Young was shown the spot by an old shoemaker, whose wife's mother was present at Captain Cook's birth, and he says there was a willow tree occupying the site, but no vestige of the walls was left. Mr. Bolkow, the present owner of Marton Hall, says, "The cottage was found destroyed when my uncle bought Marton in 1854, but we came across the foundations of it when the grounds were laid out. A granite vase has been erected on the spot. The pump, which Besant says still exists, and was made by Cook's father to supply his house with water, was put there after Cook's time, and has disappeared. In this humble clay biggin, James Cook, the circumnavigator, was born on 27th October 1728, and was registered as baptized on 3rd November in the Marton Church records, being entered as ye son of a day labourer. He was one of several children, most of whom died young. John, the eldest, who lived till he was 23, and Margaret, who married a Redcar fisherman named James Flack, being the only two that came to maturity. The Cooks remained at Marton for some years, during which time they removed to another cottage, and young James received some instruction from a Mistress Mary Walker, who taught him his letters and a little reading. Dr. Young and Kippis called her the village schoolmistress, but Ord, who was a descendant on his mother's side, says she was the daughter of the wealthiest farmer in the neighbourhood, and wife of William Walker, a respectable yeoman of the first class residing at Marton Grange. Young James, a lad of less than 8 years old, worked for Mr. Walker, tended the stock, took the horses to water, and ran errands for the family. And in return for such services, the good lady, finding him an intelligent, active youth, was pleased to teach him his alphabet and reading. In 1736, Cook's father was appointed to the position of hind or bailiff by Mr. Skottow and removed with his family to Airy Home Farm near Ayton. According to Besant, a hind was one who, residing on a farm, was paid a regular wage for carrying on the work and handed over the proceeds to the landlord. Young James, now 8 years of age, was sent to the school on the High Green, kept by a Mr. Pullen, where he was instructed in writing and arithmetic as far as the first few rules, reading having apparently been acquired before. He is said to have shown a special aptitude for arithmetic, and it is believed that owing to the good reports of his progress, Mr. Skottow paid for his schooling. According to Dr. Young, his schoolfellows gave him the character of being fond of his own way, and when any project was on foot for bird nesting or other boyish amusements, and discussion arose as to the method to be pursued, he would propound his own plans and insist on their superiority. Should his views not meet with approval, he would pertinaciously adhere to them, even at the risk of being abandoned by his companions. Staiths. Most authorities say that Cook was bound apprentice to Mr. Saunderson, a grocer and haberdasher of Staiths, at the age of 13. But Mrs. Dodds, Saunderson's daughter, told Dr. Young that after leaving school he remained on the farm helping his father till 1745, when he was 17 years old, and then went to Staiths to her father on a verbal agreement without indentures, and would thus be free to leave or be discharged at any time. The shop and the house where he was engaged was situated about 300 yards from the present slipway and close to the sea. In fact, so close that in 1812 it was threatened by the water and was pulled down by Saunderson's successor, Mr. John Smaley, and the materials, as far as possible, were used in erecting the building in Church Street, which is now pointed out as Cook's shop. The late Mr. Waddington of Grossmount, near Whitby, says he visited Straits in 1887 and found the original site covered by deep water. He was informed by an old man who, as a boy, had assisted in removing the stock from the old shop, that not only were the stones used again in Church Street, but also most of the woodwork, including the present door with its iron knocker, at which, probably, Cook himself had knocked many a time. At Staiths, Cook remained as Saunderson's assistant for about 18 months, and it may easily be imagined how this growing lad listened with all his ears to the tales of the old sailors, recalling brave deeds and strange experiences in storm and shine on that element which for so many years was to be his home, and at length, impelled by some instinctive feeling, that on it laid the path ready at his feet to lead him on to future distinction, he vowed to himself that he would not bind down his life to the petty round of a country storekeeper. At length the opportunity came, which is related in a breezy and lifelike manner by Besant as follows. After painting Saunderson's character in colours of a rather disagreeable hue, as one too fond of his grog for himself and a stick for his apprentices, he says that Cook stole a shilling out of the till, packed up his luggage in a single pocket handkerchief, ran away across the moors to Whitby, found a ship on the point of sailing, jumped on board, offered his services as cabin boy, was at once accepted, showed himself so smart and attentive that he completely won the heart of the sour-visaged mate, and through his good graces was eventually bound apprentice to the owners of the ship, and thus laid the foundation of his fortunes. This account does not explain how it was that the dishonest runaway apprentice it depicts continued to retain the friendship and esteem of his master and Mrs. Dodds. Apprenticed to the sea. There undoubtedly was a difficulty about the shilling, and Dr. Young's version, gathered from those who knew Cook personally and lived in Staithes and Whitby at the time, is more probable. He says that Cook had noticed a South Sea shilling, and being struck by the unusual design, it was only coined in 1723, changed it for one of his own. Saunderson had also noticed it, and when he missed it, inquired for it perhaps in somewhat unmeasured terms, but on the matter being explained, was fully satisfied. Afterwards, seeing that the boy was bent upon a sea life, he obtained the father's permission, and took young James to Whitby himself, where he introduced him to Mr. John Walker, a member of a shipping firm of repute, to whom he was bound apprentice, not to the firm, and with whom he never lost touch till the end of his life. The period of apprenticeship was, on the authority of Messrs. John and Henry Walker, 3 years, and not either 7 or 9 as it usually stated, and the difficulty about being apprenticed to both Saunderson and Walker is of course set at rest by Mrs. Dodd's explanation. Whitby was at the time a very important centre of the coasting trade, and possessed several shipbuilding yards of good reputation, and it was in a Whitby-built ship, the Freelove, that Cook made his first voyage. She was a vessel of about 450 tons, some 80 tons larger than the celebrated bark Endeavour, was employed in the coal trade up and down the east coast, and no doubt Cook picked up many a wrinkle of seamanship, and many a lesson of the value of promptitude in the time of danger, which would prove of service when he came to the days of independent command. For the North Sea has, from time immemorial, been reckoned a grand school from which to obtain true sailormen for the royal service. As usual in those days, Cook stayed in his employer's house in the intervals between his trips, and his time ashore was longer during the winter months, as the ships were generally laid up. The house in Grape Street, at present occupied by Mr. Braithwaite, is pointed out as the one where he lived whilst with Mr. Walker, but this is incorrect, for Mr. Waddington ascertained from the rate books that Mr. Walker's mother was living there at that time, and Mr. Walker lived in Hagergate from 1734 to 1751, removing thence to the north side of Bakehouse Yard in that year, and to Grape Street in 1752, after his mother's death. That is, he did not reside in Grape Street till 3 years after Cook's apprenticeship was ended, when, following the usual custom, he would have to fend for himself. During these periods of leisure between his voyages, Cook endeavoured to improve his store of knowledge, and it is believed he received some instruction in elementary navigation. He made great friends with Mr. Walker's housekeeper, Mary Proud, from whom he obtained the concession of a table and a light in a quiet corner away from the others, where he might read and write in peace. That he worked hard to improve himself is evident from the fact that Mr. Walker pushed him on at every opportunity, and gave him as varied an experience of things nautical as lay in his power. After several voyages in the Freelove, which is stated by the Yorkshire Gazette to have been lost, together with 150 passengers, and the winter's supply of gingerbread for Whitby, off either the French or Dutch coast one stormy Christmas, the date was not given. Cook was sent to assist in rigging and fitting for sea a vessel called the Three Brothers, some 600 tons burden, which was still in existence towards the close of last century. When she was completed, Cook made 2 or 3 trips in her with coals, and then she was employed for some months as a transport for troops from Middleburg to Dublin and Liverpool. She was paid off by the government at Deptford in the spring of 1749 and then traded to Norway, during which time Cook completed his apprenticeship, that is, in July 1749. Cook told the naturalist of the second South Sea voyage, Mr. Forster, that on one of his trips to Norway the rigging of the ship was completely covered with birds that had been driven off the land by a heavy gale, and among them was several hawks who made the best of their opportunities with the small birds. Offered command. When his apprenticeship had expired, he went before the mast for about 3 years. In 1750, he was in the Baltic trade on the Maria, owned by Mr. John Wilkinson of Whitby, and commanded by Mr. Gaskin, a relative of the Walkers. The following year, he was in a Stockton ship, and in 1752 he was appointed mate of Messrs. Walker's new vessel, the Friendship, on board of which he continued for 3 years, and of which, on the authority of Mr. Samwell, the surgeon of the Discovery on the third voyage, who paid a visit to Whitby on his return and received his information from the Walkers, he would have been given the command had he remained longer in the mercantile marine. This was rapid promotion for a youth with nothing to back him up but his own exertions and strict attention to duty, and tends to prove that he had taken full advantage of the opportunities that fell in his way, and had even then displayed a power of acquiring knowledge of his profession beyond the average. About this time, Cook's father seems to have given up his position at Airy Home Farm and turned his attention to building. A house in Ayton is still pointed out as his work, but has apparently been partially rebuilt, for Dr. Young speaks of it as a stone house, and it is now partly brick. But the stone doorway still remains, with the initials JGC for James and Grace Cook, and the date 1755. The old man has been represented as completely uneducated, but this cannot have been true. Coleman, in his Random Recollections, writing of a visit he paid to Redcar about, relates how a venerable old man was pointed out, who, only 2 or 3 years previously, had learnt to read that he might gratify a parent's pride and love by perusing his son's first voyage around the world. He was the father of Captain Cook. If it is true that he was the son of an elder of the Scottish Church, it is extremely improbable that he was entirely uneducated, and the position he held as hind to Mr. Skottow would necessitate at any rate some knowledge of keeping farming accounts. More convincing information still is to be found in the Leeds Mercury of 27th October 1883, where Mr. George Markham Tweedle of Stokesley writes, "I may mention that Captain Cook's father was not the illiterate man he has been represented, and I have, lying on my study table as I write, a deed bearing his signature dated 1755, and the father's signature bears a resemblance to that of his distinguished son. Reading is invariably learnt before writing, and as, in 1755, the old man was 61, it is evident he did not wait till he was 80 to learn to read." Father's grave. He claimed to have carved the inscription on the family tombstone in Great Ayton churchyard, and after spending the last years of his life under the roof of his son-in-law, James Fleck of Redcar, he died on 1st April 1778 at 84 years. He was buried in Mask churchyard, but there was nothing to mark his grave, and its place has long been forgotten. His death is registered as that of a day labourer. End of Chapter 1. Chapter number 2 of The Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, 1755 to 1757, HMS Eagle. Notwithstanding the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748, troubles were constantly arising between the French and English, in which the American colonies of both nations took a conspicuous part, and ultimately led to open war. The first shot was fired on the 10th of June 1755, although war was not formally declared until May 1756. In June 1755, the Friendship was in the Thames, and it is said that to avoid the hot press which had been ordered, Cook first went into hiding for some time, and then decided to volunteer. He had already made up his mind, and had refused Messrs. Walker's offer of the command of one of their ships, the acceptance of which would have saved him from the press as masters were exempt. He now saw his opportunity had come. He knew that experienced men were difficult to obtain, that men of a certain amount of nautical knowledge and of good character could soon raise themselves above the rank of ordinary seamen, and had doubtless in his mind many cases of those who, entering as seamen, found their way to the quarter-deck, and knowing he had only to ask the Walkers for letters of recommendation for them to be at his service, he determined to take the important step and volunteer into the Royal Navy. It must be remembered that this act of leaving employment, which to most men of his position would have seemed most satisfactory, was not the act of a hot-headed youth, no step taken in mere spirit of adventure, but the calmly reasoned act of a man of 27 years, and some 8 or 9 years' experience of both the rough and smooth sides of maritime life. Several letters were written to Mr. Walker, one or two of which, relating to a later period, were seen and copied by Dr. Young, but they fell into the hand of a niece, who unfortunately, not recognizing their value, destroyed them shortly before her death, which occurred some years ago. However, it is certain that he wrote one about this time, and evidently received a favourable reply, for he shortly afterwards wrote again acknowledging the service done him. Enters Navy. Having made up his mind how to proceed, Cook went to a rendezvous at Wapping, and volunteered into HMS Eagle, a fourth-rate 60-gun ship, with a complement of 400 men and 56 marines, at that time moored into Portsmouth Harbour. On the muster roll, preserved in the Records Office, the following entry occurs: 161 from London rendezvous. James Cook, A.B. Entry, June 17th, 1755. First appearance June 25th, 1755. On the 24th July, that is 37 days after the date of entry into the Navy, he is rated as Master's Mate, a position he held till 30th June 1757, when he quitted HMS Eagle. His appointment was facilitated by the difficulty experienced in obtaining men for the service, as may be gathered from Captain Hms' letters, who writes applying to the Admiralty for permission to break up his London rendezvous. As he says, it had procured very few men, and those only landmen. Again, he complains of the quality of the men he has received, and says he is 140 short of his complement. In another letter, I do not believe there is a worse manned ship in the Navy. Yesterday I received from the Bristol 25 supernumeraries belonging to different ships, but not one seaman among them, but on the contrary, all very indifferent landsmen. These complaints were endorsed by Captain Palliser, who succeeded Hamer on the Eagle, for he wrote that some of the crew were turned over from ship to ship so often that he was quite unable to make out the original one, they being such that none choose to own them. Of 44 said to belong to the Ramilleys, she wanted only 6 the other day, but her boatswain could find out only those amongst them that he thought worth having. In the face of these deficiencies in quantity and quality of men, and remembering the good character he doubtless obtained from Mr. Walker, there can be no surprise that when Cook sailed out of an English port for the first time as a Royal Navy sailor, he held the rating of Master's Mate. It is usual to look upon him as an explorer and surveyor only, but a very little inquiry shows that he played an active part in some of the most stirring events in the next few years. The records of his personal deeds are wanting, but his ship saw service, and from his character it is certain that when duty called, James Cook would not be found wanting. Many of the men under whom he served have left behind names that will always be associated with the construction of the present British Empire, and with most of them he was in immediate personal contact, and obtained in every case their respect, in some their close personal friendship. Palliser commands. On the 1st of July, the Eagle was ordered to fit and provision for the Leeward Islands, but having received 62 men and 53 marines, the orders were changed to cruise between Sicily and Cape Clear, and she sailed on the 4th of August. She was caught in a gale off the old head of Kinsale and received some damage, and her mainmast was reported as sprung, so she returned to Plymouth for survey and repairs. Thinking that the removal of the mast would be a good opportunity to scrape his ship, which was very foul, Captain Hms had her lightened for that purpose, but on examination the mast was found to be in good order, and the Admiralty was so annoyed at the absence of the ship from her cruising ground that they ordered Captain Palliser to take over the command and prepare for sea without further loss of time. This he did on the 1st of October, and sailed from Plymouth on the 7th, and after cruising about in the Channel and making a few small captures, he returned on the 22nd of November, remaining till the 13th of March, and during this time Cook had a short spell of sickness, but it can hardly be called serious, as he was only in hospital for 10 days, being back to his duty on the 17th of February. In April, when off the Isle of Bass, brought to and sent on board the cutter a petty officer and 5 men with arms, provisions, etc. This extract from the log records Cook's first independent command. The cutter was one of 2 hired vessels which had joined the squadron the previous day under convoy, and the armed party was probably put on board as a precaution against privateers, who were at that time pretty busy on the French coast. Cook took her into Plymouth Sound, and he and his 5 men went on board the St. Albans, and in her rejoined his own ship on the 2nd of May, and then returned to Plymouth on the 4th of June. Palliser, in reporting his arrival to the Secretary of the Admiralty, said that he had put ashore to the hospital 130 sick men, most of which were extremely ill, buried in the last month 22. The surgeon and 4 men died yesterday, and the surgeon's 2 mates were extremely ill. Have 35 men absent in prices, and 35 short in complement, so that we are now in a very weak condition. This sickness and mortality was attributed to the absolute want of proper clothing, many of the men having come on board with only what they stood in, and some in rags, so the captain asked for permission to issue an extra supply of slops, a request that was immediately granted. Duc d'Aquitaine. After another short cruise, the Eagle returned to Plymouth with Palliser very ill with fever. He obtained sick leave, and Captain Proby was ordered to take command, but was detained so long in the Downs by contrary winds that Palliser, who had heard a rumour of a French squadron having been seen in the Channel, shook off his fever and resumed the command of his ship, which was almost ready for sea. Every part of the Channel mentioned in the rumour was carefully searched, but no signs of the enemy were seen, and the author of the report, a Swede, was detained in Portsmouth for some months. On the 19th of November, the Eagle's crew was increased to 420 men, and she was kept cruising throughout the winter, and on the 4th of January 1757 she was caught in a heavy gale off the Isle of Wight, where she had most of her sails blown out of her. On the 25th of May she sailed from Plymouth Sound in company with HMS Medway, and a day or two afterwards they fell in with and chased a French East Indiaman, the Duc d'Aquitaine, in rather heavy weather. The Medway was leading, but when getting close, had to bring to in order to clear for action, as otherwise she would be unable to open her lee ports. Palliser, on the other hand, was all ready, and pressed on, bringing the chase to action. After a hard set to, lasting about 3/4 of an hour, the Frenchman struck, having lost 50 men killed and 30 wounded, whilst the Eagle lost 10 killed and 80 wounded, and the list of damages to the ship reported to the Admiralty shows that the action was sharp though short. The Medway was only able to afford assistance by firing a few raking shots, and suffered no damage except having 10 men wounded by an accidental explosion of gunpowder. The masts and sails of the prize were so much damaged that she lost them all in the night. One of the masts in falling sank the Medway's cutter. It was found she had a complement of 493 men, and was armed with 50 guns. She had landed her East Indian cargo in Lisbon, and then proceeded to cruise for 14 days on the lookout for an English convoy sailing in the charge of HMS Mermaid. She had succeeded in picking up one prize, an English brig, which was ransomed for £200. This was Cook's first experience of an important naval action, and Palliser was complimented by the Lords of the Admiralty for his gallant conduct. The Duc d'Aquitaine was purchased for the Navy, and was entered under her own name as a third-rate 64-gun ship with a complement of 500 men. The Eagle returned with her consort and her prize to Plymouth, and soon afterwards Cook's connection with her came to an end. According to Dr. Kippis, Mr. Walker had interested the member for Scarborough, Mr. Osbaldiston, on the subject of Cook's promotion, but the rule was that candidates for lieutenancy must have been employed on board a king's ship for a period of not less than 6 years, and an order had recently been issued that this regulation was to be strictly adhered to. Captain Palliser therefore wrote to Mr. Osbaldiston that Cook had been too short a time in the service for a commission, but that a master's warrant might be given him, by which he would be raised to a station that he was well qualified to discharge with ability and credit. The result of this correspondence is shown in the Eagle's muster roll, for on 27th June, James Cook attended his last muster, and on the 30th he was discharged, the succeeding rolls registering D. 30th June 1757, Solebay, preferment. The Mercury Cook. At this point, all the writers on Captain Cook have been led into error by following the lead of Dr. Kippis. Everyone, with the single exception of Lord Brougham, who by an evident slip of the pen puts him on board the Mersey, writes that he was appointed master of HMS Mercury, and that he joined the fleet of Admiral Saunders in the Gulf of St. Lawrence at the same time of the capture of Quebec in that ship. From the public records, it has been ascertained that the Mercury was not in the Gulf of St. Lawrence with Saunders, but in the latter half of 1759 was sent to New York, thence to Boston, and was at Spithead in April the following year. The same source also shows that not only was the circumnavigator never to board the Mercury in any capacity, but in all probability he never even saw her. He is also said to have been master's mate on the Pembroke, and Dr. Kippis has him appointed to 3 different ships on 3 consecutive days. The Grampus, but she sailed before Cook could even join her. The Garland, but she was found to have a master when Cook joined. And lastly, the Mercury. The explanation for this confusion, as far as the Mercury is concerned, the rest was imagination, is that there was a second James Cook in the service, who was appointed Master of the Mercury under a warrant dated 15th May 1759, and entered on his duties immediately. He was with his ship at Sheerness on the 12th of July, at which time his namesake was before Quebec. On the return of the Mercury from Boston, her master was returned for some time as sick on shore, and on the 11th of June 1760 was succeeded by one John Emerton. Soon after he was appointed 3rd Lieutenant of the Gosport, his commission bearing date 1st April 1760, that is, before he left the Mercury. He was with his new ship at the recapture of St. John's, Newfoundland, in 1762, with John Jervis, afterwards Lord St. Vincent, as his captain. In 1765 he was on the Wolf on the Jamaica station, and was selected by Admiral Burnaby to carry dispatches to the governor of Yucatan. This duty he successfully carried out, and in 1796 published a pamphlet describing his adventures during the journey. On his return to England, he applied to the Duke of Newcastle for the command of a cutter, and the letter is now in the British Museum, having been included in a collection in mistake for one written by his celebrated namesake. There is a certain similarity in the writing, but in the signature he writes the Christian name as Jas, while Captain Cook usually wrote Jams. The Mercury Cook was lieutenant of the Speedwell in 1773, and having had some property left him in Jersey, he received leave of absence in August. He never rose above lieutenant, and disappears from the Navy List after July 1800. A manuscript log kept by James Cook, whilst master's mate of the Eagle, is now in the possession of Mr. Alexander Turnbull of Wellington, New Zealand. End of Chapter 2. Chapter number 3 of The Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, 1757 to 1759. HMS Pembroke. Cook joined HMS Solvay on the 30th of July 1757 at Leith, where she was then stationed, but the date of his warrant has not been ascertained, although the public records and Trinity House have both been searched for the purpose. Its stay was not long, for after a cruise of a few days she returned to Leith, and on the 17th of September Cook was superseded by John Nichols. In fact, his time on board was so short that his signature is not appended to any of the rolls. In April 1757, Mr. Bissett, who was master of the Eagle when Cook was master's mate, and who therefore would have a better chance than anyone else to measure his subordinate's character and capabilities, was appointed master of HMS Pembroke, a new ship, and superintended her fitting for sea. On the 26th of October, he found himself transferred to the Stirling Castle, and it is only reasonable to suppose that, having formed a high opinion of Cook's work and knowing of his ambition to rise in the service, he would give information of the opportunity and, as far as he could, push forward his friend's interests. At any rate, the muster rolls show that in less than 6 weeks from leaving the Solway, Cook was established on board the Pembroke as master under a warrant bearing the date 18th of October 1757, and entered upon his duties on the 27th of October, the 29th anniversary of his birth, and from that date to his discharge into the Northumberland he signed the usual documents. At the time of his joining, the ship was fitting and victualling for sea at Portsmouth, and on the 8th of November she sailed for the Bay of Biscay under the command of Captain Simcoe, returning to Plymouth on the 9th of February 1758. Louisbourg. The British government had decided on making a determined effort to wrest the colony of New France from the hands of the French, and one of the few steps was to attempt the capture of the port of Louisbourg at the entrance of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a place which the enemy were said to have rendered almost impregnable at an expenditure of some £1,250,000. They looked upon it as second only to Quebec in its importance to the safekeeping of the colony. In order to carry out this design, a fleet was prepared under Admiral Boscawen, known to his men as Old Dreadnought, and from a peculiar carriage of the head, said to have been contracted from a youthful habit of imitating one of his father's old servants, Wry-necked Dick, to convey a small army under Major General Amherst to the scene of action. Boscawen sailed with his fleet, one member of which was the Pembroke, for Halifax, where they arrived via Madeira and the Bermudas on the 8th of May. Having completed his arrangements, Boscawen left Halifax on the 28th of May with 17 sail of the Royal Navy and 127 transports, picking up 2 more men of war and 8 transports just outside, and a couple more of the latter a few hours later. He had to leave behind at Halifax, with orders to rejoin him as soon as they were fit, several ships, the Pembroke being one, as their crews were so weakened by scurvy during the voyage from England. The Pembroke had lost 29 men, but was sufficiently recovered to be able to sail with 3 transports, 2 schooners, and a cattle sloop on the 7th of June, and arrived off Louisbourg on the 12th, 4 days too late to take part in the landing which had been successfully carried out in the face of great difficulties caused by the roughness of the weather, the rocky coast, and the opposition of the enemy. In fact, James Wolfe, who was a brigadier throughout the siege, and on whose shoulders seems to have fallen, says, "Our landing was next to miraculous. There were 3 officers and 49 men killed, 5 officers and 59 men wounded of the army, 11 men killed, and 4 officers and 29 men wounded of the navy, and 19 men wounded of the transport service. The weather was so bad that no stores or artillery could be landed for several days, the first gun being got ashore on the 16th, so Cook was in plenty of time to take his share in the difficult task of landing supplies, a task so dangerous that the fleet lost 100 boats in this duty alone. As well as forming the supply base for the army, the fleet also provided 583 men to act as gunners and engineers ashore, but none of these were from the Pembroke. The nature of the ground rendered the work of constructing the approaches and batteries extremely difficult, and it was not until the 20th of June that the first gun opened fire. Wolfe formed a battery on Lighthouse Point, one side of the entrance to the harbour, whilst the town was on the other side, with a fortified island in between, and the harbour held a French fleet which, at the time of the arrival of the British, consisted of 9 men of war. One escaped on the very day of the landing, and was shortly afterwards followed by 2 more. One, El-Hewie, was captured by Sir Charles Hardy and taken into the British Navy, whilst the other, though chased for some distance, made good its escape to L'Orient with the first news of the siege. Previously to the coming of the British, 2 ships had been sunk in the harbour's mouth to render entrance therein difficult. 2 more were added to these, and then a 5th. One ship was blown up by a British shell, and setting fire to 2 others that lay alongside her. They also were destroyed. The fate of the other 2 is described in the Pembroke's log, kept by Cook, as follows. In the night, 50 boats, manned and armed, rowed into the harbour under the command of the captains Laforey of the Hunter and Balfour of the Etna, in order to cut away the 2 men of war and tow them to the north-east harbour, one of which they did, viz. The Bienfaisant of 64 guns, the Prudent, 74 guns being aground, was set on fire. At 11 a.m. the firing ceased on both sides. The boats concerned in this attack, which Boscawen describes as a very brilliant affair well carried out, were a barge and pinnace or cutter from all the ships, except the Northumberland, which was too sickly, commanded by a lieutenant, mate or midshipman, and Dr. Graham, in his History of the United States of North America, says, the renowned Captain Cook, then serving as a petty officer on board of a British ship of war, co-operated in this exploit, and wrote an account of it to a friend in England. That he had distinguished himself may be inferred from his promotion to the rank of lieutenant in the Royal Navy, which took place immediately after. This statement that he was in the affair may be true, but there is no evidence on the point, and as he was a warrant and not a petty officer, and as his promotion did not take place for several years, Dr. Graham's story may well be doubted. It is believed that Cook did write to Mr. Walker from Louisbourg, but the letter was one of those so unfortunately destroyed. The loss on this occasion to the British was very slight, there being only 7 killed and 9 wounded. The Bienfaisant, having been surveyed, was received into the Navy and given to Captain Balfour, whilst the command of El-Hewie was conferred on Captain Laforey. In consequence of this success and the threat of an immediate assault on the town, the French commander, Monsieur Drucourt, decided to surrender on the following day. This success was highly esteemed in England, and Admiral Boscawen and General Amherst received the thanks of the Houses of Parliament. Wolfe and Hardy. After the siege, Wolfe wrote to Lord George Sackville, speaking in warm terms of Boscawen and his men, and says, Sir Charles Hardy too in particular, and all the officers of the Navy in general, have given us their utmost assistance, and with the greatest cheerfulness imaginable. I have often been in pain for Sir Charles's squadron at an anchor off the harbour's mouth. They rid out some very hard gales of wind, rather than leave an opening for the French to escape. But notwithstanding the utmost diligence on his side, a frigate found means to get out, and is gone to Europe, charge d'Fanforenades. I had the satisfaction of putting 2 or 3 howitzer shells into her stern, and to shatter him a little with some of your lordship's 24-pound shot, before he retreated, and I much question whether he will hold out the voyage. The Pembroke formed one of this squadron under Sir Charles Hardy, and after the capitulation of the town, was dispatched with 9 other ships and a small body of troops under Wolfe to harry the French settlements around Gas Bay as a preparation for the attack on Quebec it was intended to make in the following year. Several settlements and magazines were destroyed, 4 guns and a pair of colours were captured, and then the squadron returned to Halifax for the winter. Admiral Sir Charles Saunders was selected to command the fleet that was to be employed in this new movement against the capital of New France, a man of whom Horace Walpole wrote, "The Admiral was a pattern of the most sturdy bravery, united with the most unaffected modesty. No man said less, or deserved more. Simplicity in his manners, generosity and good nature adorned his genuine love of his country." With Durell's squadron, he left Spithead on the 17th of February 1759 with the intention of calling at Louisbourg, the appointed rendezvous for the expedition, on his way to Halifax. But the season had been so severe that Louisbourg, usually free from ice, was found to be unapproachable. So he went on, arriving at Halifax on the 30th of April. Admiral Durell had been sent out earlier from England, and was now dispatched from Halifax with a squadron, of which the Pembroke was one, to prevent, if possible, the entry into the river of the usual spring fleet from France with supplies and reinforcements for Quebec, and to keep the French from putting up any fortifications on the Île-aux-Coudres, thereby adding to the difficulties of the fleet in ascending this dangerous portion of river. The weather was bad, and the trouble caused by fog and ice so great that Durell found the fleet of 18 sail, convoyed by 2 frigates, had escaped him, but 1 or 2 small storeships were captured, which proved of service to the British afterwards. On the way up the Gulf, Captain Simcoe of the Pembroke died, and the ship was given temporarily to Lieutenant Collins of Durell's ship, and afterwards to Captain Wheelock, who remained in her till after Cook left. Durell's squadron arrived off the Île-aux-Coudres on the 25th, and on the 28th the Pembroke landed the troops she had on board, as did ye rest of ye men of war, and they took possession of the island, which was found to be deserted by its inhabitants. The troops that were on board Durell's ships were under the command of Colonel Carleton, the Quartermaster General of the force, and Wolfe's great friend, whose services had only been obtained from the King with the greatest difficulty. Whilst awaiting the arrival of Saunders with the remainder of the expeditionary force, every endeavour was made to gain knowledge of the difficulties of the river, and Cook's log notes how the boats were out sounding ye channel of ye traverse, and on the 11th of June there is returned satisfied with being acquainted with ye channel. The traverse here spoken of is that channel running from a high black-looking cape known as Cape Torment across into the South Channel, passing between the east end of the Ile d'Orleans and Ile Madame. It is still looked upon as one of the worst pieces of the river navigation. The British had some charts of the river showing the course taken by the French vessels, for in a note to the orders issued by Saunders on the 15th of May to the masters of transports, special attention is called to a plan or chart showing the route which His Excellency intends to make from Louisbourg Harbour to the island of Bic, and this chart was most probably taken from one captured by Boscawen in 1755, and published in September 1759 by T. Kitchen in the London Magazine, having the traverse shown on a larger scale. The sounding taken at the time Durell was waiting would be to verify those shown on this chart. After a short delay in Halifax, Saunders left for Louisbourg to gather up the remainder of the forces and stores. and on his arrival still found the port hampered by ice. In fact, Major Knox of the 43rd Regiment relates that even so late as the 1st of June, men were able to get ashore from their ships, stepping from one piece of ice to another. There was also another cause for dissatisfaction: delay in the arrival of the ships with soldiers and stores. Some of the troops had been directed to other work without any intimation to Wolfe, whilst others were in a very bad state from scurvy and measles. Some had lost their entire equipment, and it was with the greatest difficulty replaced. The supply of money was criminally small, and yet it is pleasant to read on the authority of Major Knox that I had the inexpressible pleasure to observe at Louisbourg that our whole armament, naval and military, were in high spirits, and though, by all accounts, we shall have a numerous army and a variety of difficulties to cope with, yet under such admirals and generals, among whom we have the happiness to behold the most cordial unanimity, together with so respectable a fleet and a body of well-appointed regular troops, we have every reason to hope for the greatest success. Orders to transports. Before leaving, Saunders issued his instructions as to the order of sailing. He divided the transports into 2 divisions, the starboard flying a red flag and the larboard a white one. He assigned to each vessel its position and duties, and pointed out to each master of a hired transport that if the orders of his officers were not promptly and exactly carried out, they would be fired on, adding with a touch of grim humour that the cost of the powder and shot so expended would be carefully noted and charged against the hire of the offending ship. On the 6th of June, Saunders was off Newfoundland with 22 men of war and 119 transports, and the cold winds blowing off the snow-covered hills of that island were severely felt by the troops. On the 18th, when off the island of Bic, they were joined by Wolfe in the Richmond, and 5 days later, after picking up Durell at the Isle of Courtrai. Here, Saunders transferred his flag to the Stirling Castle, which he had selected in England for the purpose, owing to her handiness. Cook's friend, Mr. Bissett, was still on board, and leaving Durell with 11 of the deepest draught to guard against any interference from a French fleet, he proceeded up the river with the remainder. The work was hard, constantly anchoring and weighing to take every advantage of wind and tide, and the progress was slow. But at length the whole of the ships passed the Traverse, and on the 26th the fleet anchored off St. Laurent on the Isle d'Orleans, and the troops were landed on the following day. Thus the much-dreaded passage up the St. Lawrence had been carried out, and the fact that no loss of any kind had occurred to either man of war or transport reflects the very greatest credit on all engaged in the operation. Knox relates how the master of the transport he was on, a brother of Trinity House and Thames pilot named Killick, refused the services of the French prisoner as pilot, and observing, "Damn, I'll show them an Englishman can go where a Frenchman daren't show his nose," took his ship up himself, chaffing the occupants of the mark boats as he passed, and in the end declared that it was no worse than the Thames. The wonderful success of their passage was emphasized the afternoon after their arrival at St. Laurent, when a heavy gale struck the fleet, driving several ships into collision or ashore, and causing considerable loss in anchors and cables. As soon as possible, the men-of-war boats were out rendering every assistance, and all the vessels were secured but 2, which were too firmly fixed to be towed off-shore, and these were soon afterwards burnt by the enemy. Fireworks. thinking to profit by the disorder which must necessarily have been caused by the storm, the French made a determined attempt to destroy the fleet by means of 8 fireships, which were floated downstream on the unsuspecting British. Fortunately, they were ignited prematurely, and the boats of the Pembroke and other ships were again out, employed in the hazardous task of towing these undesired visitors into such places as would permit them to burn themselves out without danger to the shipping. 6 were quickly got into safety, whilst the other 2 grounded and burnt out without causing further inconvenience. Captain Knox describes the scene as a display of the grandest fireworks that can be possibly conceived. The only result was to cause the retirement of a picket at the western end of the Isle d'Orleans, and the officer in command, who thought he was about to be attacked in force, was to have been tried by court-martial, but being advised to throw himself on Wolfe's mercy, was pardoned for his error of judgment. To guard against a repetition of such an attack, a system of guard boats, some moored across the river and some patrolling, was established, entailing considerable extra work on the sailors. An examination of the position showed Admiral Saunders that the safety of the fleet, and therefore the interest of the army, would be best consulted if he proceeded into the basin of Quebec, as to remain cooped up in the South Channel added to the danger if a further attempt should be made to fire the fleet. He therefore pointed out to Wolfe that the small battery established by the French on Point Levy, which threatened any ship entering into the basin, should be taken, and the point occupied. This was at once carried out by Monckton's brigade, and a battery was established which did serious damage to the town. When too late, the French sent over 3 floating batteries to aid in repulsing the English, but they were driven back by 1 broadside from a frigate Saunders moved up for the purpose. Montcalm had entrenched his army on the north bank of the St. Lawrence, between the rivers Charles and Montmorency, and Wolfe determined to seize on a piece of high ground to the east of the Montmorency, to form a camp there, and endeavour to force on a general action. In pursuance of this design, a body of about 3,000 men were landed successfully on the 9th of July, under the protecting fire of some of the fleet, and a camp was formed, and the next few days provided employment for the boats of the Pembroke and other ships in landing men, stores and artillery. The bombardment of the town opened on the 12th of July from the batteries erected at Point Levy, and a portion of the fleet continued with little intermission until the 13th of September, when fire was opened on the town, other ships in the basin and guns at the camp at Montmorency opened on Montcalm's line at Beauport. On the 18th, 2 men of war, 2 armed sloops, and 2 transports succeeded in passing the town without loss, but a 3rd ship, the Diana, ran aground in trying to avoid collision with a transport, and was attacked by the enemy's boats, but was brought off by the Pembroke and Richmond. She was so seriously damaged that she had to be sent to Boston for repairs, and then returned to England. On the 20th, Wolfe joined the upriver squadron in a barge, and in passing the town he had his mast carried away by a shot from the Sillery battery, but no further damage was done. He made a short reconnaissance which led to nothing at the time, but may have had an important influence on the choice of a landing place afterwards. Attack on Beauport. On his return to his camp at Montmorency, he decided to make an attack on the left of the French lines, from the boats and from his camp over a ford which was available at low tide between the falls of Montmorency and the St. Lawrence. This attack was to be supported by the Centurion, moored in the North Channel, and by 2 armed cats, which were to be run aground as near as possible to some small redoubts the first object of the attack. Here, it is certain that Wolfe and Cook came into personal contact, for on the latter fell the duty of taking the necessary soundings for the position to be occupied by the cats, and Wolfe refers in a dispatch to a conversation he had with Cook upon the matter. The attack took place on the 31st of July, aided by the fire of the Pembroke, Trent and Richmond, which were anchored clear over to the north shore before Beauport, a brisk firing on both sides. But the boats were thrown in confusion by a reef, marked on the chart as visible at low water, and were some time before they could effect a landing. Then a heavy storm of rain came on, rendering the ground, which was steep, very slippery. The troops occupied one redoubt, but was so dominated to get no further, and Wolfe deemed it desirable to recall them and to stop the advance across the ford. The two cats were burnt to prevent them falling into the hands of the enemy, and the losses of the English in killed, wounded and missing were 443, those of the French being estimated at 200. Cook says the repulse was solely owing to the heavy fire from the entrenchments, which soon obliged our troops to retreat back to the boats and Montmorency. Order throws the blame on the Louisbourg Grenadiers, a picked body of men from several regiments, whom he considers got out of hand. He also, in a dispatch submitted to Saunders, threw some amount of blame on the Navy, but to this the Admiral strongly objected, and it was withdrawn. Wolfe saying, "I see clearly wherein I have been deficient, and think a little more or less blame to a man that must necessarily be ruined, of little or no consequence." It has been asserted that Cook led the boats to the attack, but as this was done by Wolfe himself, according to his own letters, and as Saunders was also out with them, both officers having narrow escapes, it seems more probable that Cook would be on his own ship, where, as she was engaged, his services would be wanted, for it was one of the master's most important duties to work her under the captain's orders when in action. A few days before this attack on Beauport was made, the French again paid the fleet the undesired attention of a large firecraft composed of several small vessels chained together and laden with all sorts of combustibles, shells, guns loaded to the muzzle, tar barrels, etc. And again this was grappled by the boats and towed away to a place of safety, and then Wolfe, sending in a flag of truce the next morning, said that if the performance were repeated, he should cause the instrument of destruction to be towed alongside two ships in which he had Canadian prisoners, and there let it do its worst. This somewhat cold-blooded threat was sufficient, and the experiment was not repeated. A narrow escape. During the time the fleet was occupying the basin, the masters of the ships were constantly out making observations and sounding, partly for the necessity of the fleet and partly to throw dust in the eyes of the French, and on one occasion Cook had a narrow escape from capture. His men had to row for it to get away from the enemy, and reaching the Isle of Orleans, landed just in time, for as Cook, the last man, sprang ashore from the bows, an Indian boarded over the stern. The hospital picket turned out, and the French retreated. His friend, Mr. Bissett, was not so fortunate, being taken prisoner on the 7th of July while sounding in the North Channel, but he was either exchanged or escaped, for he is only absent from his ship for a few days. Wolfe, who was almost always ailing, had an attack of fever, and the worry of the repulse at Beauport rendered him incapable of duty for some days. He therefore laid before his brigadiers plans of future movements, asking their opinions and advice. These plans were not approved, but it was suggested that an attempt should be made to land on the western side of the town and there bring the enemy to action. And Wolfe writes, "I have acquiesced to their proposal, and we are preparing to put it into execution." The upriver detachment had been strengthened by the addition of a few more vessels, and Bury with 1,200 men had joined in an unsuccessful attempt to get at the French supply fleet, which had retreated to a place of safety. He had outwitted de Bougainville, who was detached to watch him, and succeeded in destroying a magazine containing clothing, powder, and other stores, and intercepted letters which told of the surrender of Niagara and the retirement of Bourley-Marquis upon the Ile-aux-Noix, to which place Amherst was preparing to follow. When Wolfe's resolve was taken to follow the advice of his brigadiers, Saunders again strengthened the force above the town, placing the squadron under the command of Admiral Holmes. And on the 3rd of September, his boats withdrew the artillery and troops from Montmorency to Point Levis, and on the night of the 4th, all the available boats and small craft were sent up, one of the last to pass being a small schooner armed with a few swivels and called by the sailors the Terror of France. She sailed by in broad daylight, drawing the fire of every gun that could be brought to bear on her, but was untouched, and anchoring close alongside the Admiral's ship, gave him a salute from the whole of her armament. The troops, which had been quietly marched some distance up the south bank from Point Levis, were taken on board the ships, the last detachment on the night of the 12th, and Admiral Holmes sailed up the river as if to beat up the French communications. But when night fell, he returned, and the landing was successfully accomplished, and is described by Saunders in his dispatch as follows. The night of their landing, Admiral Holmes, with the ship and troops, was about 3 leagues above the intended landing place. General Wolfe, with about half his troops, set off in the boats, and dropped down with the tide, and were by that means less liable to be discovered by the sentinels posted all along the coast. The ships followed them about 3/4 of an hour afterwards, and got to the landing place just at the time that they had been concerted to cover the landing, and considering the darkness of the night and the rapidity of the current, this was a very critical operation, and very properly and successfully conducted. In the meantime, the ships in the basin, some 15 in number, distracted the attention of the French by a heavy cannonade on the Beauport lines, and the boats made a feint as if an attack were contemplated. Buoys had been laid in such a way as to lead to the idea that the ships were going to moor as close in as possible, as if to support an assault, and every effort was made to draw attention away from the movement up above. The Plains of Abraham. Lieutenant Norman of the Pembroke shortly describes the battle in his log. At 4 a.m. General Wolfe landed just below Cape Diamond with the whole army. At 8 the signal of boats manned and armed to go to Point Levis weighed and dropped air up. About 10 the enemy marched up and attacked General Wolfe. The action lasted not 10 minutes before the enemy gave way and ran in the great confusion and left us a complete victory. Our army encamped on the plain aback of the town and made the necessary disposition for carrying on the siege. Admiral Holmes hoisted his flag on board the Lowestaff, just off the landing place. In this action fell General Wolfe. Of the enemy, General Montcalm and his 2 seconds. Cook does not mention the death of Wolfe, but says, "The troops continued the pursuit to the very gates of the city. Afterward they began to form the necessary dispositions for carrying on the siege." Cook is said by some writers to have piloted the troops to the landing place and has even been set within hearing of the legendary recitation by Wolfe of Gray's eulogy. But as he was out with the Pembroke's boats in the basin at the time Holmes started up the river, and was probably on his ship, with his hands full driving the bombardment, and the recital of the eulogy at such a time was probably a myth. The traditions may be put down to imagination. The boats were piloted to the landing by Captain Chads of HMS Vesuvius. The town having surrendered 5 days after the battle, the movements made by Saunders in the basin no doubt aided Monsieur de Ramsay, the governor, in coming to a decision. General Murray was left with a garrison, and the fleet sailed for England, sending a detachment of the Northumberland and 6 others to Halifax with orders that Captain Lord Cole Pennant as Commander-in-Chief of the North American station, and as soon as the season opened, he was to return to the St. Lawrence to render support to any further movements made in Canada. Appointment to HMS Northumberland. Before the fleet left, however, Cook's connection with HMS Pembroke came to an end. Captain King, who was with Cook on his last voyage, writes to Dr. Douglas that he does not know the exact date of Cook's appointment to the Northumberland, but he was certainly master of that ship in 1758. Here King is in error, for Lieutenant James Norman of the Pembroke has the following entry in his log under the date 23rd September 1759. Mr. Cook, master, superseded and sent on board the Northumberland per order of Admiral Saunders. It has been said that Lord Colville made this appointment, but of course he could not do so, though he may perhaps have applied for Cook's services. But it is far more probable that the appointment was made by Saunders for the special purpose of having the survey of the St. Lawrence thoroughly well carried out. End of Chapter 3. Chapter number 4 of The Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, 1759 to 1762. HMS Northumberland. On the way down the river from Quebec, the fleet appears to have found the passage very difficult, the dangers of the channel being aggravated by the strength of the current and bad weather. The captain, Vesuvius, and Royal William were aground for some time, but were ultimately got off again without much damage, and the Terrible, which was drifting and in great danger, was only brought up by means of an anchor constructed for the occasion by lashing one of the quarterdeck guns to 2 small anchors. When her large anchors were hauled up, they were found to be broken, and so great was the loss of these articles that Lord Colville was obliged to press the Admiralty for a fresh supply to be sent out immediately, as he found it impossible to replace those